Hi, this is Boki, and today I'm going to be reviewing The Tiger's Daughter by Arsenault Rivera. The Tiger's Daughter is a fantasy novel set in sort of like a pseudo-Asia. It follows the story of Shizuka, who is the imperial niece of the Hokaran Empire, and Shefali, who is the daughter of the leader of the Koran people. Hokaran is kind of like a Japanese analog, and Koran is analogous to like a Mongolian nomadic tribe. The two girls grew up in these different cultures, but there's a lot of interaction between these worlds, and for these girls in particular, their mothers have been really close friends. So from birth and from a really young age, they've been kind of sort of raised together, even if they've been raised apart as well. Both girls are extremely capable, some might even say supernaturally, and that puts them sometimes at odds with some people, but it also puts them at odds with some supernatural forces that are at play and that have been long believed to be sort of conquered and like not a threat to both of their people. The book is mostly told through the perspective of this letter that Shefali has sent to Shizuka when they're both young women. And in this letter she details their long shared history together, both from when they're young girls who are coming into their powers to when they're teenagers and they're contending with like real physical like demons, as well as their growing love for each other. The book focuses primarily on the contents of this letter, but there are moments where we are removed from it and we see Shizuka reading it and we see her responses to different things that are documented within it. We come to quickly understand that Shizuka and Shefali, despite their love for each other, have been separated for some mysterious reason. And Shizuka has transformed from this incredibly confident young noble girl that Shefali documents in the beginning parts of this letter to a deeply shaken and removed empress. And I think part of the mystery of the book is coming to understand the disconnect between Shizuka of the letter and Shizuka as we see her outside of it. When I heard about this book, I initially kind of thought it was too good to be true. I mean, it has like lesbian demon fighting warrior queens, which is like, why are there not more books like this? And I saw a lot of buzz around it, and I was kind of skeptical the way that like I think a lot of us get sort of skeptical when things seem both too good to be true and they have a lot of buzz. I was also a little bit nervous because as you can tell from the description, this is a book that is clearly very inspired by East Asian cultures and that is written by a non-East Asian author, or like basically not an author who is coming from one of those cultures. I decided to give it a chance after reading a few pages in the bookstore because the writing seemed kind of nice and elegant, and in kind of in a way that suggested like books that I really love, like Kushil's Dart, that have sort of this, what I call like the grande dame kind of feeling, like this kind of story where these women have led these epic lives and now they're documenting it. And this book definitely lives up to my hope that, you know, it would be this epic story of these two immensely powerful women who are in love with each other. Like at its core, it really satisfies that kind of basic promise. I especially love the portrayal of the nomadic Koran people because I haven't seen that as much in fictional stories. I went through an obsessive phase of reading a lot about Genghis Khan a while ago, and even though I don't think I retained a lot of what I learned, this book felt a lot like getting reacquainted with that kind of aspect of history that I thought was really interesting, but also kind of reframed through the lens of powerful women. Shizuka and Shefali are also really amazing characters who play off of each other in as clear contrasts. Shizuka is like incredibly cocky. She's this young woman who's like not afraid at all to show off to like noble people, to demons. Like she's just like, I know how to use a sword, I know how to like beat you, I'm gonna do it. And it's really fun to read like this young girl character who's just like, I'm badass. And Shefali, on the other hand, is like much more quiet, and yet she shows a similar kind of strength. She might not show the same confidence, at least not overtly, but it's interesting to see these two characters both be represented as really strong in such different ways. And it's interesting because Shefali is much more quiet, but her voice is the dominant one in this book because she's written this long letter to Shizuka. This book has a number of other powerful women in it as well, which is also cool because I love it when books don't just like stop with like the main female character. Shizuka and Shefali, both of their mothers are incredibly powerful, again in different ways. They operate in different power structures with different skills. I'm just really impressed with kind of this cast of characters in this book. For the most part, I have some caveats to this that I'll get into a little bit later, but I mostly appreciated the writing style and I thought it matched the setting of the book. It's one of those things where I felt like I was definitely kind of transported to the world of the book through the writing style itself in addition to the story. It's not a super intensely action-filled fantasy story. Like, there are moments of action, but for the most part, it's a little bit kind of slower. So I think if you go into this expecting constant battles, you might be a little disappointed. The romance between Shizuka and Shefali is kind of similar. If you're reading this book, you most likely know that, you know, there's going to be a love story between these two characters. And so you kind of like read the interactions knowing that's coming. And I think the love story, it builds in a very natural and slow way, but it's not like this all-consuming kind of like dramatics-filled romance. And so I didn't really feel like I realized how invested I was in this romance and just the story in general until I got to the very end of the book. I got to the end of this book and I immediately cycled back to the beginning because they connect in a way that, while a little bit silly in retrospect as far as just kind of like plot contrivances go, I also didn't expect it. And I think up until that point, I didn't realize entirely what the book was building to. And so once I got there, that moment really just swept me away and really made me want to go back to the beginning and kind of revisit like how everything in the story connects. It's the kind of ending that can be very abrupt, but because there's this nice sort of like cyclical aspect to it that connects it to the beginning, it was really satisfying and it made me really excited for the next book. But while I did enjoy this book, and I do think there's kind of a strong sense of style to it that suits the story, there are moments when you can kind of see the seams in the writing. This is the kind of prose that is really striving for elegance. It's really striving to sound like beautiful and melodic. And when that works well, it's really beautiful and it draws you in, but it also means that, you know, any awkward moment really stands out. I noticed this especially when the book was trying to deal with like important topics like racism and sexuality in the context of this fantasy world. I felt like at those times, the writing seemed a little bit self-conscious, like the anxiety of getting those topics right kind of superseded the actual writing, and you can just kind of see them happening. Those discussions of sexuality and racism, like they clearly mirror very modern day, you know, real world discussions of the same topics. They reflect like a lot of the same vocabulary that we see like every day on the internet. It's also possible to have these like very kind of contemporary discussions of race and sexuality in a fantasy setting. I mean, like, N.K. Jemisin is maybe like the shining example of how to do that. And I think The Tiger's Daughter is like on the right track in trying to address it. It's just the writing itself that makes those moments feel a little bit more after school special than like kind of seamlessly woven in with the rest of the story. I also want to get back to something that I talked about in my initial skepticism of this book. This is a book that is clearly inspired by East Asian cultures, and that was not written by an author who is either of like Japanese descent or like Mongolian descent or Chinese descent. There's also a Chinese aspect to the story. And before this book came out, I saw a review on Goodreads from someone of Japanese descent who is very critical of a number of the elements in the book, and I will link to this review below. I do recommend reading it if you're thinking about checking this book out. The reviewer was particularly frustrated by the use of Japanese culture and what I think they consider a poor portrayal of racism in Asian cultures, as well as just general fetishization of Japanese culture and particularly Japanese imperialism. This review did make me a little bit hesitant to pick the book up, and while I did ultimately enjoy The Tiger's Daughter, I'm glad I still read this review to get a little bit of a better understanding of how the book was constructed and particularly where it's weakest. After reading the book, there are actually a number of points in the review that I don't agree with, but I think those are more just kind of differences in how I read the book, and I am not someone who's of Japanese descent, and I think the bigger picture that the reviewer is getting at is ultimately much more important to keep in mind than what I see as differences in how we interpreted the book. Asian cultures, particularly East Asian cultures, are really popular to portray in Western media, but generally only through like an aggressively exotified lens. Even when media from like Japan or Korea or China does make it into the US, it's inherently done with a lot of the original kind of context, the cultural context surrounding it, like you know, left behind where it was made. And ultimately, I think what happens for a lot of us is that we make the bad assumption of thinking that we're experts in a society that we're only experiencing in passing. Just as someone, you know, from an Indian American perspective, I've had interactions with people who say, go to watch a Bollywood movie or go to an Indian wedding or get a henna tattoo, who suddenly feel qualified to explain my culture to me. So I can understand the frustration of being of Japanese descent and maybe reading this book and feeling like there are certain elements of this book is getting wrong, and that will cause other people to misinterpret your culture. I don't think it's impossible for a non-Asian writer to produce a book like this, but it takes a significant amount of work that I think the Goodreads reviewer is calling into question. Avatar: The Last Airbender, the TV show, not the movie, set a really high standard, I think, for media whose creation is led by white people and is targeted towards a Western audience, but that has very specific cultural references to certain times and certain places from Asian cultures, or really a lot of non-Western cultures. I think it takes a tremendous amount of work, and I think it also takes a really delicate balance of specificity in the references you're making to these cultures, as well as the imagery that you're using, but also kind of some sort of extrapolation away from the real history. I stand by my enjoyment of the book as a story, and especially it was a little like refreshing to read as someone who's a little bit bored of the kind of Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings sort of dominant fantasy stories that are, you know, usually super white and hyper masculine and heteronormative. But I think the reviewer was also right to be frustrated that, like, this book could have been better written and better researched by, you know, an author who maybe actually is from one of the cultures that's clearly at the root of the inspiration of this book, and they probably would have had a harder time being published. So while I have these frustrations, this was still a book I really enjoyed for kind of this journey it took me on, and the two characters particularly who are at the center of it. I mentioned this book in my Books Bought in 2017 video. It was one of the books that I had bought without reading it, and I was a little bit nervous about whether or not I was going to actually like it, and I did like it. I'm ultimately glad that I have it. I am excited for the next book, The Phoenix Empress, which is due to come out in June apparently. It sounds like it'll be focused a little bit more around Shizuka and the changes that kind of we observe in her and the Tiger's Daughter, but that we have like no explanation for. So I'm excited for the gaps in that story to get kind of filled in. So thank you guys for watching, and bye!